Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of our wrapping gown sew-along. I'm Christina with Burnley and Trowbridge, and in this final installment of our sew-along, we are going to be doing all of the construction for our wrapping gown. Now, if you missed part 1, check out the link below to get caught up, and I've also linked our piecing tutorial so you can prepare your piecing before we continue. For construction in this video, I am going to show you what we call the bag method from our pattern instructions. This is a method of construction that we actually observed while studying the tartan or plaid wrapping gown in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg, and it's really cool because it's a super efficient way to assemble this garment with as little stitching as possible. Once you're ready, let's get started. So we want to start by grabbing our pieces that we cut out from part 1. And we are going to go ahead and lay our outer and lining fabrics flat with right sides together. You're going to want a big surface for this, so clear a floor, or if you have a really large table, that will work as well. Now we are going to actually start seaming. So right now we want to use a running back stitch to seam the front and back lower hems, the center front opening, not the neck area, just the center front edge, and the sleeve hems. We're not going to do anything with the side seams yet. So let's go ahead and stitch through both layers. So we're stitching through the outer fabric and our lining at those places using the running back stitch. All right, so you can see I've got the back bottom hem, both of the sleeve hems, and then both sides of the center front edge and bottom front hem completed. Once we have taken care of the hems, the center front edge, the sleeve hems, now it is time to deal with the side seams. And I'm going to level with you all. This is going to seem very weird when you're doing it, and you're probably going to think that you're doing it wrong or that I'm crazy and this can't possibly end up turning out as a wrapping gown with functional arms. But trust me, trust the process. I promise if you follow the instructions, we're going to end up with a fully functional, super easy to stitch 18th century wrapping gown. To get the side seams prepared for stitching, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to turn some of this in a kind of special way. So if we open up our two pieces by our sleeve, we've made a little hole. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull the front side corners down through the hole in the sleeve. And what will happen is the sleeves will start turning, which is what we want them to do, so that now the right sides of our fronts and the right sides of our linings are facing each other, and our sleeve looks like not a sleeve, and that's okay. And as this happens, you'll notice that the rest of the front has kind of started to turn itself as well, where those wrong sides are starting to turn, so it's turning itself right side out. And what we want to do, so this is what that half looks like right now. What we want to do is take this corner, that raw corner of the front, and we're going to let it finish turning right side out. So at this point, we have the front piece right side out and the back piece still inside out. So when we lay it flat, you can see our front piece here that is now right side out, and our back piece here that is still inside out. And you will notice that the edges look a little bubbly when they're flat. And that's okay. You can give these a good press if you would like to, but ultimately, when we're looking at examples of this treatment in the 18th century, it is not super neat and tidy, In fact, we actually do see in some cases the lining being visible from the exterior, so it's kind of slid underneath. Remember that these are mass produced garments in the 18th century, and this method is especially good for a mass produced garment because of how little stitching is actually involved. They're not going for precision here. Now, if you like precision, because that's how you are in your modern life, you can absolutely press all of this and keep things really neat and tidy, but also understand that in the surviving documents, in those original garments, that's not really what we're seeing. We're seeing kind of a little bit of mix matched seams. We're seeing the linings actually extending past the exterior on the original garment and vice versa on the original garment as well. So you don't have to be obsessed with everything looking pressed and neat and flat and perfect unless you want to be. So it's your choice. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is it's already started happening where you can see our front has already started to kind of slide in between the two layers of our backs for the wrapping gown, and we're just going to let that finish happening. So what we want to do is we want to open up the two layers, so lift up the lining from the exterior of the back side, and we're going to take our front pieces and just tuck it in the rest of the way. This diagram kind of shows you a little bit of what's going on here, but also you can slow the video down here if you want to. So what's happened now is we have the two layers, so our back exterior fabric and our front exterior fabric kind of nested inside of one another. And we want to match the bottom seam here, just like you see there, and then let that fold here. We're going to go ahead and anchor this with a pin as well, just to keep that edge pretty consistent, although it's not always consistent in original garments. So we've got our two layers of the exterior with right sides together now, and then we have our two layers of the lining with right sides together as well. And we're going to stack those layers along the edge so that they all match up. And then you can kind of shake it a little bit before you lay it flat. Make sure we're matching up the arms. So the edges of the sleeve, we want to match those hem seams this way, just like we did on the bottom as well. Turn them in, and we can anchor this with a pin. And once we've got that kind of as neat as we can get it, let's go ahead and pin these edges together before we do the same thing to the other side. Just try to keep everything as neat as you can so that your edges aren't really far off. If they're a little bit off, that's okay because we can trim this after we stitch it. We don't want them to be super duper far off. So once we have this side pinned, let's go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. So I'll show you this process kind of one more time. We have our front and our back. And we're going to open up the two layers at the sleeve. We're going to take the corner of our front, slide it through, and then our sleeve will start to fold in half. So it's starting to look like this. Our front's beginning to turn right side out, so you can kind of see that there. We'll lay it down. Finish turning the front piece right side out. Again, press here if you'd like. You can press the center front edge too. We can also press this when we're done. And then we're going to open up the 2 layers of the back and slide the front in between the 2 layers. Let's go ahead and match our bottoms, just like that. Put a pin in to anchor the bottom. Might as well match our sleeves too. And we can put a pin in to anchor that. Give it a little shake. And now let's check our layers, lining up our side seam and pinning along that edge. Okay, so once the side seam edges are aligned on both sides, so we should have 4 layers, our 2 exterior and our 2 lining, we're actually going to stitch them together. So we are going to seam from the hem of the sleeve, under the arm, down the side of the body, all the way to the hem of the lower part of the body. You can use a running back stitch for this, just like we used on the rest of the garment so far. That will be perfectly strong enough to make this work. If you're more comfortable using a back stitch, you can. It will take a little bit more time though. And again, this construction method is all about economy of time and kind of making sure that we're putting this together quickly without it falling apart. So let's seam that up. So now that both side seams are stitched and this thing looks like it's an unwearable garment, we're going to make some magic happen. Before we turn this inside out, one thing that we might want to do is trim or clean up those side seams, particularly in the underarm area where we might want to put a couple of snips in for ease when this turns right side out. This is particularly important if you gave yourself a little more seam allowance than normal, or if your seam feels a little chunky. You don't want to cut it so small that your fabric will ravel, especially if you're working with the fabric that seems like it can ravel a lot. But just trimming that up is going to make this turn a little bit more nicely and eliminate some of that bulk from the inside. And in the pattern, you're stitching this with 3/8 inch seam allowance, so you could trim this back to say 1/4 of an inch, especially if your fabric looks like it's not going to fray too much. And then what you might want to do in the underarm is make a couple of just small snips to help that turn nicely. And we'll do the same to the other side. And once we've done that, what we're going to do is we are going to turn the gown right sides out through the neck opening. And we want to do this by actually taking our exterior fabrics and we're going to turn to put the exterior fabrics on the outside. So we're going to be turning with 2 layers in one hand and 1 layer in the other hand. So just keeping the exterior fabrics to the outside. At the sleeves. And it will kind of do this. So it looks like just a big hole as we go, but keep pulling the exterior fabric. if we've done everything correctly, you can shimmy shake everything out, and there we are. We have a recognizable and almost finished wrapping gown. So if we didn't press these again, you might have a little bit of fluffiness at the edges. You can certainly press those if you want to, but it's not necessary. And another thing that you might notice is at the joins for the side seams, because they were nested in one another, they may not match up perfectly. And that is exactly what we observe on the originals as well. So they might be offset a little bit, or you might actually have one where the lining has rolled up a little bit towards the outer of the garment, and that's okay as well. You can finagle with that if you really want to, but keep in mind that on the originals, they don't seem to be bothered by the fact that those might be a little bit off. So I wouldn't spend too much time stressing about it. Embrace the 18th century mentality and the 18th century construction method for a mass produced garment. Now, if that is something that is going to bother you, then we definitely wouldn't recommend this construction approach. I would say if you want things to be extra neat and extra tidy, you probably want to stick with the set-in lining method, not the bag lining method, because it just makes it impossible to have everything match up perfectly the way that it is nested inside of itself when it's stitched. So that is something to consider when you're making these garments. The only part of the garment left to finish is the neck opening, so let's go ahead and take care of that now. And at this point, if you would like to, before we do anything else, you can turn back your seam allowance of 1/4 inch and baste. You can also just press it, or if you are good eyeballing things, you can leave it, turn that back if it will stay. My wool isn't going to hold that. I'm just going to go ahead and leave them, and I'll fold them as I'm putting them on. But basting here is certainly recommended, especially if you're newer to sewing. This will help keep those pieces kind of nice and tidy as we apply them to the neckline. Now, when we get to the neckline, I actually like to baste this area to hold the two layers together before I apply my neck piece. And in this case, the basting can help so that we can actually mark our stitching line on the front portion of our neck opening. And to do that, we're going to take our neck stitching template, and there's a dotted line that is curved. That is the line that we want to mark for stitching on our fabric. And it says not to cut along the dotted line because we actually do not want to cut our fabric into the curve. We just want to mark this line onto the fabric. So to do that, I am going to actually trim away my curve on my pattern piece only. And now I can lay this on my front edge, line it up with the fold at the top and the center front edge, and then we can just mark the stitching line in chalk or pencil. And we're not going to cut it on our fabric. We've only trimmed it away on our pattern piece so that we can mark that line. But we're going to leave the fabric straight there. We're just going to baste that line onto our front so that we see where we need to stitch later when we put the neck piece on. And I'm just using the same thread that I was using to assemble mine. You can certainly use a different color if it's easier for you to see. And this basting is performing two jobs for us. It's showing us our line that we need to match up our pieces to, but it's also going to help us keep these layers together when we apply the neck piece. So we do want to baste then all the way around the back opening as well. This basting can either be pulled out later or hidden by your neck piece depending on how things line up. So I'm not worried about matching the color. I just happen to have this red thread here, so I'm going to use it. And then I'm going to baste my other curve in as well. So now that my neckline is basted, let's go ahead and trim away any really long threads so that they don't get in our way when we're stitching. You'll get those predominantly in the corners. So the easiest way, I think, to work this is to work it flat by laying the gown lining side down and opening up your neck slits until they make two 90-degree corners to make a little void of a rectangle here. And what we're going to do once we've opened that up is we are going to match the center back of our neck piece, which you had a little mark on your pattern piece if you aren't sure where that is. And we're going to match that to the center back of our pattern. So we've got the center of our body and the center of our neck piece. We've got our turn under. We're going to just anchor that there. And then we'll go ahead and anchor along the rest of the bottom. Remember, we've basted this back 1/4 of an inch. And this is where it gets a little interesting because we are taking the straight edge of the neck piece and we are going to be applying that straight edge to the curved stitching line. So we're not curving the fold in our neck piece. We're actually keeping it nice and straight, but we're matching it to the curved stitch line. This is going to help the neckline of the wrapping gown rest better into the curve of the neck because your neck isn't straight there either. And then it should line up pretty well near the front edge. If it doesn't line up here, if your fabric, you've basted it back your 1/4 inch and it has extended past the front edge, go ahead and pull the basting out along the top and fold it down a little bit just to make it match how you want it to so that it's nice and flush. And then we'll do the same thing for the other side. And you can see we've got a little bit of wrinkling in the corners where we've opened up the neckline cuts because we took something that was flat and we're kind of making it 3-dimensional now when this is going to stand up. So that's okay. You just want to keep things as flat as you can around the neck piece. We don't want that to start getting wrinkly. And we'll apply, again, applying that straight edge to the curve. And we'll anchor that down. Checking our top to make sure that it's in line with our front edge of the body. So if yours looks like this, you're in good shape. And what we are going to do at this point is stitch on our outer neck piece that we've just put on. And this is where I am going to be using our twist. So I've got some quilter's twist, and that's because that tends to be what they're using for the exterior stitching that we see when they're working in wools or silks. And what we're going to do here is we are just going to use a spaced back stitch to top stitch from the exterior along those 3 edges. And we're going to do that pretty near to the edge through all of the layers. And when you get to the corners, they can be a little finicky. You just want to try to get things as flat as possible while you put those stitches in so that they'll lay nice and neatly when you're all done. So once the outer is secure, we've top stitched that, as you can see there, and this is what our inside looks like. We are going to hem the inside piece down, so our lining piece. So we can flip this over, take our neck lining piece, and we want to lay it in basically the same way that we did the outer. So it should cover all of those raw edges. Try to keep everything as flat as possible. And when we get to the top edge, if you've basted these back and you've lined everything up, then those will hopefully match one another. And if they don't, then we just want to adjust so that they do. So we want them to match each other, and we also want them to match the front edge so that there's a clean line from the front edge up to the neck piece. So once you have that adjusted how you would like it, where we've folded those edges in towards one another, we will secure them. And this should be a little bit easier in full size. Half size can be a little finicky, especially when I'm working with bulkier fabric. So once that lining piece is secured with pins, then what we're going to do now is, just as we stitched the exterior on, we are going to stitch the lining on, but we are not going to use a spaced back stitch. We are actually just going to use a hem stitch or a felling stitch, and we're going to stitch this on from the interior, going through at least the lining. And if you do go through the outer layers, that's fine. You do want to try to just catch the seam allowance inside, but we see stitches that do make it all the way to the outside of the garment as well in this process. So it's not a big deal if your stitches go through all layers. So I'm just going to use a hem stitch here, and we'll hem the 3 sides where it meets the body, and then we'll actually also continue hemming along the top where it meets the outer neck piece. And again, just do your best to keep everything nice and flat. If you are unfamiliar with hemming or felling, we do have links in the description below to our tutorial series that will teach you these stitches. And honestly, the nice thing about this method of putting on the neck pieces is that it works for any construction method. So whether you're lining or not lining, doing a set-in lining, doing a bag lining, this will always be how you put in that neck piece. And once your neck piece lining is in, that's it. And that's it. If everything has gone according to plan, we should have a finished wrapping gown. Wear it with pride in casual historical settings, to feel grand as you sweep around your house, or even if you're just having yourself a Stede bonnet moment. It's yours to do with as you will. Friends, thank you so much for joining us, and if you like this video, don't forget to click the thumbs up, Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date as we release new content, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram to see what we're up to on a daily basis. Until next time, happy sewing!